Microsoft was the dominant technology company in the 1990s until it came under fire for anti-competitive practices. Internet Explorer was tightly coupled to the Windows operating system, which prevented Netscape Navigator, a competing browser, from reaching users on this dominant platform, the Windows platform. This episode is about antitrust, what businesses can and cannot do in the name of competition, and what the impact of Microsoft's legal battles in the late 1990s was, and how the law might respond to potential technology monopolies in the near future, such as Facebook, Google, and Uber. Our guest today is Harry First, a professor of law at the New York University School of Law. He wrote a textbook called The Microsoft Antitrust Cases, Competition Policy for the 21st Century, and we get into all kinds of interesting topics like what makes a monopoly. Is it actually bad to be a monopoly? What are the practices that make a monopoly bad? And all kinds of interesting ideas around business and software. I hope you enjoy this episode, and please give me feedback on this, because this is less directly related to engineering itself, more related to the impact of certain business outcomes that can arise from engineering decisions. Life is too short to have a job that you don't enjoy. If you don't like your job, go to hired.com/SEDaily. Hired makes finding a new job enjoyable, and Hired will connect you with a talent advocate that will walk you through the process of finding a better job. It's like a personal concierge for finding a job. Maybe you want more flexible hours or more money or remote work. Maybe you want to work at Facebook or Uber or Stripe or some of the other top companies that are desperately looking for engineers on Hired. You deserve a job that you enjoy because you're someone who spends their spare time listening to a software engineering podcast. Clearly, you're passionate about software, so it's definitely possible to find a job that you enjoy. Check out hired.com/SEDaily to get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. A $1,000 signing bonus from Hired when you find that great job that gives you respect and salary that you deserve as a great engineer. I love Hired because it puts more power in the hands of engineers. Go to hired.com/SEDaily to get advantage of that special offer. And thanks to Hired for being a continued longtime sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. Harry First is a professor of law at the New York University School of Law and the co-author of The Microsoft Antitrust Cases, Competition Policy for the 21st Century. Harry, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you, Jeff.
I want to start off by talking about antitrust and monopoly in broad terms, and then we'll get into the Microsoft legal cases. What is antitrust?
So antitrust is a poorly named statute, which dates from 1890, when it was about a legal device called a trust. But really, a better name for it would be pro-competition. So it's a statute that is about fostering competition in markets and making certain that players in those markets, firms, don't restrain competition.
Okay, and why do we need competition in markets?
So there are two main things that antitrust law tries to do and benefits of competition. So one benefit of competition is lower price. And by lower price, we all know what lower prices are, but the real goal is to have price come closest to cost so that the sellers aren't making excessive profits. So that's one purpose. The second purpose is to make sure that competitors aren't excluded from the market. So antitrust is about stopping exclusion. And we don't like exclusion because, well, we like competitors so the prices go down, but also so that different products are produced so that consumers have choice. And consumers can decide what they prefer. And also, very importantly today, so that firms have incentives to innovate, to push each other to come out with new products, the new products that we eventually may come to love or may decide we don't like.
So when we're talking about a market with multiple competitors, what is meant by the term anti-competitive behavior?
Well, anti-competitive behavior involves two kinds of things. One is agreements. Generally, the ones that are of most concern are agreements between or among competitors. So they may be agreements to fix prices. That's a core problem I just mentioned. But also agreements as to the kinds of services that are offered, the terms of service, the areas in which competitors will operate. So an agreement that says, I'll take this geographic market, you take that one, or I'll take this product market, you take that product market. Those kinds of agreements are of concern. So those restrain competitive choices. They restrain competition between the firms, and you have less competition. So that's a primary concern. But there's also a concern for the behavior of single firms or monopoly firms that have such a large share of the market that they can set a high price or exclude future competitors, particularly disruptive competitors. So that's a particular concern of antitrust law.
Okay. So companies can take different types of actions, and some actions are going to proactively help their customers, and other times the actions that a company takes might just be targeted at hurting a rival and just disrupting somebody who might become a competitor. Why is it important for us to distinguish between these two types of strategic actions, like the type of action that could proactively help a customer and the type of action that could just hurt a rival company?
Well, great question. The ultimate goal of antitrust that many express, although it sometimes has an unclear meaning, is to increase consumer welfare. So the focus is on what will benefit consumers. So if firms engage in what we think of as pro-competitive behavior, it's behavior that will benefit consumers by lowering price, operating more efficiently, bringing new products to market, things like that. So they help the customer, and that is the goal. That's what competition is supposed to do. And the other end is, instead of helping the customer, you hurt the competitor. So businesses want to win, as we all know, and we would prefer them to win by doing things that help customers, not winning by doing things that hurt their competitors. So we would rather have them lower prices than bomb their competitors' factories.
Right. So in the case of Microsoft, what is an example of a business decision that was made in the 90s or early 2000s that was designed to hurt rivals, and in contrast with a decision that would proactively help their customers? Perhaps if we're talking about this Microsoft stuff, we're thinking of it in terms of this is a decision that Microsoft would have made with the intent of creating or preserving monopoly status.
Right. So there were a lot of things that Microsoft did, and let me just, I'll pick one that was clearly designed to hurt a competitor. So at one point, Apple needed a browser for its Mac operating system, and it also needed to have Word, the Office productivity suite, but particularly the word processing program that would operate on Apple computers. So Apple had a choice. They could use different kinds of browsers, and Bill Gates said to Steve Jobs, well, if you decide to use Netscape, we won't develop a compatible version of Word for Apple. So you'll be up the creek, shall we say. I'm sure he said it more colorfully. On the other hand, if you agree to use Internet Explorer and not Netscape, then we will develop the word processing program that will be compatible with Apple. So basically saying, we want to exclude Netscape from the market, and we're going to use our power that we have over you, Apple. Hard to believe now that Microsoft at one point did have power over Apple. That's why I chose the example. We're going to use that to pressure you to make a business decision that you might otherwise not have made.
Certainly.
So that's an example. Now, the example that was perhaps more ambiguous, although in the end not, at one point there weren't browsers, hard to believe, and at one point the question was how to get browsers to consumers. Netscape was doing very well, had a very popular browser, and Microsoft said, well, we're just going to offer Windows with our Internet Explorer browser bundled in a way that consumers would get it whether they wanted it or not. Now they said, gee, this is great. You have an integrated program. It works seamlessly, blah, blah. On the other hand, it excluded Netscape from the market. And in fact, at that point, the browser, the Internet Explorer browser, was an inferior one. So a lot of the argument, at least that Microsoft put forward in some of the litigation, was we did this to help consumers, to offer them an integrated product. Argument that the prosecutors put forward was, no, you didn't. You could offer it in different ways. This was really an effort not to help consumers, but to hurt competitors, to exclude the upstart competitor, the disruptive competitor, which was Netscape, from the market.
So you've talked about how this could be ambiguous or not ambiguous depending on the way that it's framed in the courts, depending on the way that Microsoft framed it. My impression was that it was kind of a confluence of those offensive decisions that Microsoft made together with the public perception of Microsoft and the way that Microsoft flaunted itself. And I think this has a lot of historical relevance, particularly when you compare that to how companies create public perceptions for themselves today. What was the public's perception of Microsoft in the late 90s, and how was Microsoft presenting itself?
Well, it's a great question. It's sort of hard to put yourself in the full public's point of view. This was a time in which people were sort of waking up to the possibilities of the internet. You have to say that Bill Gates was fully aware of how the industry was moving, and he understood the challenge that Netscape posed and the sort of the challenge of the internet. So he identified that. I think that in part there really were, in a way, two camps. There were the lovers of Microsoft, thought that this was just the hottest technology that could be. But I think the public perception of Microsoft was affected actually a lot during the course of the trial on the monopoly case, in which Microsoft came across as the heavy, as just willing to throw its weight around. Often, interestingly enough, in light of today's disputes still, often revealed in emails that were unvarnished, shall we say, where it revealed that they just wanted to get rid of Netscape. And so I think the public's perception began to shift, and there was a lot of news coverage. This was front page news in major newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, about the trial and about what Microsoft did to try to thwart Netscape's efforts.
Okay, so this case that went to that was in front of the U.S. Justice Department, this was the center of the case was around the browser. Is that correct? It was the browser.
That
the
really
Netscape
was the heart
decision.
of the case, right?
Yeah. Okay. So was that case representative of other things that Microsoft was doing, like these, the other things like the Microsoft Word type of leverage that Microsoft was trying to do against Apple?
Well, what happened in the course of the litigation, the litigation was triggered, although it's a more complicated story and interesting in itself, but the particular case that the Justice Department and 20 states brought in 1998 was initially triggered by this bundling in of the Internet Explorer browser into Windows. So that was the trigger, but that wasn't the only thing that the government prosecutors presented in court. They presented a lot of different behavior that involved the Java programming language, that involved Sun, pressuring Sun, that involved efforts to do in IBM's competing OS/2 operating system. So it turned out, although the trigger was the browser and it was sort of the heart of the case, it turned out that this was what was thought of as systemic behavior. It was the way Microsoft operated, where they were willing to throw their weight around as against, it was AOL, it was just a whole host of players in the industry, all designed to push out the rival browser, which was Netscape, as well as the Java programming language.
Mm-hmm. So this collection of behaviors was really, I think it was epitomized by the way that Bill Gates was depicted in these 1998 videotaped depositions that eventually made it to the court. Well, I mean, he was deposed, and then this footage was shown in court. And this is pretty interesting, and I was kind of researching for this episode. Like, I didn't realize that Bill Gates was kind of vicious back then, because you look at footage of him now, especially now that he's heavily involved with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's this super docile guy. You couldn't imagine him, killing a fly. But compare that to his attitudes in the 90s, and it is starkly contrasting.
Well, it is interesting, sort of the culture of Microsoft. It was not just Gates, but Steve Ballmer as well, which was a very aggressive culture, and it seemed to be indifferent to either the law or government efforts to control the company from Washington. So the deposition was, sort of classic making or just allowing this person to present himself in a way that appeared incredibly evasive and, just aggressive. And it did not help his case at all. So first thing, well, it wasn't the first contact that the district court judge who tried the case had, but it really, I think it helped to set the tone. Bill Gates was a very smart guy, and by the time a later case came around that had to do with the remedy, and he testified in court then, he had learned how to present himself much better. But at that point, he hadn't, and perhaps like very successful people, when they turn into clients, they might not listen to what their lawyers tell them. So that did not help Microsoft's case.
Although it also seems like, to some degree, the attitude that Bill Gates and Microsoft took in the early days of the trial was due to sort of a contempt of the court for its lack of technical understanding, which was maybe not entirely unjustified, because I think I remember some of the key prosecutors didn't use computers on a regular basis. Was there an element of technical ability versus non-technical ability that played into the way that the trial proceeded?
Well, I think in part it is an arrogance thing, and it's the difficulty sometimes that technical people have in trying to translate things to lay people. So district court judges, Judge Jackson was a smart guy. He's not a technical person, and when you try a case, you have to be able to make your case understandable. It's actually one of the great strengths of the U.S. legal system. So you can't just talk to yourself. You have to talk to smart people who see a range of things and make it understandable. And this is what David Boies, as the lead lawyer for the governments was able to do. Now, Microsoft and I think on the government side, yes, of course, there was a learning curve. These are lawyers. We're really not trained as computer people, but lawyers have to understand the area in which they're practicing from a technical end. It's true not just here, but in every kind of case. So there was a learning curve, and the problem is, of course, that Microsoft had an informational advantage. They both knew what they did, and knew what things they could try to do, perhaps to hide those things, and understood the technology. So yeah, it was a challenge, I think, from the government's point of view. They hired experts. They tried to understand better. And I think in the earlier days, it may have been a little problematic. But Microsoft hurt itself by sort of pushing things a bit too far, and doing things in ways that just didn't make sense to Judge Jackson. So at one point they were ordered to unbundle the code for an early version of Internet Explorer. So they took Judge Jackson literally. They said, well, Judge, if we do this, Windows won't work. And guess what? We're going to make Windows not work. So this was not a good move. They had better ways of making their point, but instead what they seemed to tell him was, you can't do anything about this, ha-ha. And he found ways. Now, he maybe didn't quite understand what he was doing, but ways of masking or, removing, quote-unquote, Windows. He said, I can do it. Why? It's still working. And then he brought in an expert, Ed Felton, who said this is ridiculous. So technical problems are a problem. The government had a learning curve, but I think they got up it fairly well.
Yeah, that's my impression. It does feel like by the end of the trial, they had the case boiled down to a key set of issues where the technical obfuscation was boiled out of it, and there was really a frank discussion where the prosecutors did understand what they were prosecuting Microsoft for, and maybe you could describe what the outcome of the trial was. I mean, we kind of glossed over this a little bit, but maybe you could kind of abbreviate the proceedings and then describe what the outcome of the trial was.
Well, the outcome of the trial basically, the government presented a case sort of focused on bundling, but the other things. The bottom line of all sort of looking across the broad spectrum was that Microsoft's conduct was intentionally designed to exclude its disruptive rival, Netscape and Sun, through means that didn't help consumers but just hurt them. And again, going through all of the different things that it did, particularly the bundling in of the Internet Explorer browser, but in a way that meant that you couldn't remove it. So it was a little more focused than just integrating the products. You couldn't disintegrate the products. That was the core, and then all this other activity. The bottom line was that the district court judge found in a very lengthy opinion that in fact Microsoft's conduct was aimed at suppressing competition and suppressing innovation. To send a message to the technical community that if you go up against a Microsoft product, we are going to go after you. So legally, it was a finding that they had violated Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is outlaws monopolization, as well as Section 1, which are these agreements in restraint of trade. And then the question was the remedy, which became a very difficult part of it. But it was pretty much a clear victory for the government that Microsoft, through lots of different ways, had violated the antitrust laws.
Yeah, so this remedy process was a little drawn out. What was the ultimate outcome of that?
Well, this I think is the most problematic part of the government's case, the most difficult, and frankly, it continues to be difficult in high technology cases. So once you find out what's going on in the past, the question is, well, what do you do about it? Now, this is a civil case. Microsoft's not being punished for something. There's not a fine. Nobody goes to jail. It's what sort of what do you tell them not to do in the future? Particularly, technology moves on, as you know. How can you deal with this? So there were two basic approaches. One is to tell them to stop doing a bunch of different things, called a conduct remedy. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And maybe some positive things. You must share some technology or, share information. So that's one part of the remedy. The second part is, well, maybe this is systemic. This is the way Microsoft operates. The only way we can change them for the future to be more competitive is to restructure them so that the incentives they had will be altered in the future. So the government pursued both aspects for remedy. The district court judge said, okay, we'll stop them and join them from doing certain things, but we're also going to restructure them. We're going to break them up in sometime in the future. But for now, we're going to wait and see what the Court of Appeals does. So he stayed that remedy, and then the case went on appeal. So very difficult to figure out what do you tell them to stop doing, and is it time to break them up?
Mm-hmm. And it was ultimately decided that the company did not need to break up.
Yeah, through a lengthy process. When the case went up on appeal, there were some differences in the way the Court of Appeals saw the case, although not basically in the heart of the case. And the Court of Appeals did not like the restructuring remedy, said the remedy has to be tailored to the wrong, to what Microsoft did wrong. So the Court of Appeals vacated that remedy and said, you go back to the district court judge and let the district court judge figure out what the remedy should be. Ultimately, some but not all of the parties settled, and no restructuring, just a decree that told them they couldn't do a number of things and had to share some information about the protocols for communicating between the Windows desktop and servers. But structure came off the table. Part of the reason was the Court of Appeals didn't seem too favorable, and part of the reason was there was an election, and there was a new leadership in the Antitrust division.
Okay, so when I read about the fallout from this case, there are some people who say a narrative that this was really an inflection point in Microsoft's strength as a company. Bill Gates perhaps left as CEO because he was frustrated with the legal proceedings or he was exhausted. I guess this is not exactly a legal question, but what is your perspective on that? You were definitely paying more attention to this around that time than I was. I was much younger. This was not something I remember very well, but
right.
What's your perspective on that?
Well, I was much younger too, but anyway, it's been a while. So many people were critical of the settlement, and I think that we would have been better off had Microsoft been restructured. I think Microsoft would have been better off. I think we would have had more competition. But
so in that restructure would be like the internet business, and then the other business.
The basic restructuring was apps ops, as it was called. So all the applications would go in one company, and the operating system would go in another company. So that would remove the incentive for the company that owned Windows to favor applications that were its own, and to tie those together to help continue the operating system monopoly, and force them to find other strategies to make sure that they succeed as an operating system. And similarly, the applications, Microsoft Applications Company couldn't benefit in ways that were never fully pinned down. A trial, frankly, wasn't the focus, but from that integration where they had some sort of advantage in compatibility over their competitors. The unexplored part was Word. Word has won, as we all know, as word processing application. It is tremendously profitable for Microsoft. It was, but it was always easier for the developers, to have a fully integrated program because they were in the same company as the operating system, as Windows. So that wasn't touched, and that continued to be very powerful. So if that had been pulled apart, who knows what would have happened, but maybe we would have had more competition. So there were a lot of people who were critical of that. People were critical of the injunctive relief in itself, that maybe didn't go far enough, or it was only stopping practices that some of which Microsoft appeared to have abandoned. I think in retrospect, the injunctive part of the remedy might have been more helpful than at least I gave it credit for, and that others gave it credit for, because it stopped behavior that Microsoft might very well have engaged in to suppress developments in the mobile operating systems for mobile phones. So they were already moving in 1999 to pressure Nokia. It's hard to remember back this far, but there was a nascent smartphone at the time, and they were trying to pressure Nokia with its what was then called the Personal Digital Assistant, PDA, to adopt Microsoft operating systems. So they couldn't do that anymore, and in the mobile space they'd have to win on their own, and we know that they didn't. So this may have opened up breathing space for other competitors. Steve Jobs was quoted as saying at one point, telling the head of the antitrust division, just tie Bill Gates down for a few years. That's all we need, and we'll develop, products that'll be really great. Not exactly what the head of the antitrust division was thinking he was doing, but that was Jobs's view. That's a whole other podcast. But yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, so I'm really curious about to what degree this caused Bill Gates to leave and go off on philanthropic.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have no particular insight into that. Steve Ballmer stayed for a while and ran the company. I don't really know. I do know, however, that Windows continues to be enormously profitable for Microsoft. So although they may struggle in some other parts of the business, one of the things that didn't happen from the litigation was to end their monopoly in the operating system market, which in some ways was, you might think, what the government was trying to do. So if you look at sort of recent figures in terms of Microsoft's profits, their annual revenues from Windows is about $18 billion with a B, and about 92% of that is profit. So this is still a very lucrative business, and one with that the government in the end did not interfere with.
Wealthfront is an automated investing service that saves you time. As an engineer, your time is valuable. If you want to invest, but you don't want to spend significant time evaluating your portfolio and allocating assets, take a look at Wealthfront. Go to wealthfront.com/SEDaily to open an account today and get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. $15,000 managed for free when you open your account. With traditional investment services, there are many humans in the loop that are doing things that Wealthfront automates away. When you pay the commissions and account fees of these traditional investment services, you're paying for work that could be done by a computer. So don't pay commissions and account fees. Maximize your gains with Wealthfront's Set It and Forget It investment automation. check out wealthfront.com/SE Daily. It would support Software Engineering Daily, and it would introduce you to the world of automated investing. Wealthfront.com/SE Daily. Thanks to Wealthfront for being a continued sponsor of the show. Now, let's get on with the show. Like, I think about this as a software engineer. Like, as a software engineer, the places that I have, there's a direct correlation between how much I enjoy working at a place and how much I admire the leadership and how inspiring the leadership is. And I think it's really hard to understate how important the leader of a particular organization is. And I think you would find a very extreme correlation between how inspiring a leader is and the cadence of its stock price increase. And so I do think about this question of like, did this trial lead to Bill Gates leaving the company? But whatever, that's all speculation. But moving towards the present, like when we look back now at the Microsoft case, many of the counter arguments that Microsoft was making in the case came true. So, for example, Linux is now the dominant server platform. Mobile platforms have emerged out of both Apple and Google. Java became the dominant language. Facebook and Amazon have created these giant defensible businesses that are totally agnostic of the Microsoft platform. And this is such a stark contrast to a world, the world of the 90s where it looked like Microsoft was just going to eat the world. And my sense, I know it's hard to think about the counterfactual case, but my sense is that we could have had this degree of technological growth even if we didn't have Microsoft stifled by the courts. Do you think that's accurate?
Partly. So I think what Bill Gates saw was, he said at one point there's going to be more innovation in the communications part of this business than in anything else. And I think the things that you are talking about are very much internet enabled. So why are servers so important? Why is Facebook what Facebook is? Why is Google what Google is? These are, Gates did not control the internet. Now he wanted to. He wanted to control the portal by controlling Internet Explorer. So in a sense, the counterfactual, maybe, so if there never had been a case, would they have been able to extend from the desktop into these new technologies and control them better? Maybe not completely, but better. And we don't know the answer to that. That's why I say maybe my skepticism of the conduct part, reining in their sharp elbows, was more effective than we might have thought at the time, because they couldn't get into new markets with sharp elbows. They had to get in on the merits. And, there are lots of other firms with merits. So, but, you mentioned Linux. Linux never got a foothold on the desktop. What's happened is that servers have become really important. And Microsoft's efforts in part were to control the server space. This is actually what the European case was a lot about. So I think, of course, I teach antitrust and write about this, so I like to think this is really important and useful. So
yeah, so not to nitpick, but
that's where I'm coming from. Right.
No, it's totally fair, but not to nitpick, but Linux is actually, Android is Linux, and Chromebooks are Linux, and
right,
these
right. But when that's true, but if you. So what is?
There's not a strong point there to what I'm saying, because I actually think what you said was totally accurate. Like it's really hard to think about the counterfactual. Like if Microsoft said, okay, Internet Explorer cannot cannot serve traffic from Linux servers. Like if Microsoft would have said something like that, it would have totally hobbled Linux as a server platform because all of the consumers would still be on Microsoft, and we have no idea what would have happened. And this space moves so fast.
So let me ask you a technical question. Did Linux take advantage of the protocols that Microsoft was forced to write and publish for connecting servers to the desktop?
I don't know the answer to that, but I am pretty sure that the answer is yes.
Yeah. So there you are.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
So other people have told me that one of the things, there was always a fear that actually Microsoft, that there was hidden code. So by forcing Microsoft to reveal all the code for the protocols and the interfaces, that took away that fear. So it all helped, these other, the things that needed the interconnection with the desktop. So, hard to say exactly, but Microsoft really resisted writing those protocols. It took a decade to force them to really do it right. So my feeling is when they're resisting, there's a reason.
Right. Real quick, do you have a hard stop at 11, or can you go 10 minutes over? Okay, cool. So as we continue to talk about the present, I want to contrast the Microsoft case with some modern cases. So let's take Google, for example. Is Google a monopoly today?
Great question. The question whether you're a monopoly for antitrust depends, first of all, on a technical definition of what a market is, because you have to monopolize a market. That's where the law is. And the question is search a market? Since search is unpriced, some people argue it's not really a market because it's free. But I think net bottom line, I haven't seen the exact figures, but I would say if you can define search as a market, which I think it is, it gets monetized through advertising, Google has a monopoly position. There are, other search engines, but I think Google has a monopoly position, yes.
And so this is
but Google's the easy case. So go ahead.
Okay. What's a less easy case?
So a less easy case is Apple, Amazon, Facebook, the platforms that seem really powerful, but it's not really clear how we're going to define their markets and how we think about their market power. So those actually are more difficult. It may explain why, from a monopoly point of view, or for the Europeans' abuse of dominance, the first focus has been on the search engine, on Google.
Right. So what I think about with these other companies, so like Amazon, for example, I think is an interesting case because Amazon strikes me as they're very conscious of the potential of being accused of monopoly, and one way that they kind of evade that is there is no price discrimination on Amazon. And so I think that there is some shadow of Microsoft in the way that these companies behave. But could you, I guess, put a little more color on how the case of Google having a monopoly on search and that being easy to classify, how does that contrast with these other businesses? I mean, why isn't it easy to classify Facebook as having a monopoly on an identity system, or Amazon?
Well, yeah. I like the market definition of an identity system. I think just those words conjure to me. So tell me what that is exactly. Social networking. Are they a monopoly on social networking? When you have LinkedIn, when you've got other, you're always looking for substitutes. So what can people turn to? Usually when the reason why pricing is important, because the first cut of this is, so suppose the seller raises the price by some amount, what choices are there available to consumers? If there aren't any, that's a sign that they have the power to raise price, which is monopoly power. So for search engines, they don't raise the price for anything. So it's a little harder. You need different kinds of evidence. But it gets murkier when you look at Facebook. So what are the alternatives to Facebook exactly? Well, I don't know. Facebook does so many things, right? People get a lot of their news from Facebook. So are newspapers competitors? You have all of these, because of the multiplicity of services that these companies provide, it becomes a little more elusive. Google is sort of easier to pin down because they seem to have defined products and services that you can separate out. So, the pure search engine seems like something that sits on its own. So that's why, as I said, I think Google from an antitrust point of view is easier. The others are challenging because they do seem to control something, but it's a little harder to define it. And I'm going to try to remember what you suggested as the market definition. What was that again? Identity system. I like it. I'm going to try. I'm going to use that in my class this fall.
Oh,
see
great!
If they think it's a market identity system. But so it's hard. It's after you get past that, it may be hard to identify exactly what they're doing that's wrong. How are they excluding competitors? How are they raising prices? Again,
right. Okay, so you're saying even if Google is a monopoly on search, if they're not doing anti-competitive stuff, there's nothing wrong with that?
Right. Just having a monopoly. This is standard view, I guess, throughout the world. Just being a monopolist is not a problem.
Right.
It's what you do with it. So for the U.S., it's whether you engage in conduct either to acquire monopoly improperly or to maintain your monopoly improperly. The maintain part was what the litigation against Microsoft was about, maintaining the monopoly. So in other parts of the world, it's whether you abuse what's called a dominant position, roughly monopoly, but maybe not quite the same, and you're looking at abusive behavior. So, for Google, it would be, do they favor their own other, vertical search sites? Do they, are they doing something in the way they array search so that they favor themselves? That might be an abuse of their dominance.
Right.
And that's what the Europeans are looking for, price comparison. Or it may be for the Android system, are they licensing Android in ways that exclude competing systems or applications, make it hard for competitors, to exist. So, that may be a problem for them. It may be a problem for Apple and the way they use their App Store. So these are things you can focus on, and you look for either exclusion or price raising conduct.
Now, did Google break itself up into Alphabet in order to avoid accusations of monopoly?
I don't think so. I think they did it just to confuse us all as to who the heck is Alphabet. But it's not. If they did, I can't believe they're very sophisticated, and I don't think that's the basis. They have been from the beginning. I think they have wanted to be not Microsoft. They've wanted to see if they could, grow in a way that would escape antitrust scrutiny, and they could do things right. And they've tried very hard at this. They've run into some roadblocks now, but so I think their business conduct, maybe more so than other companies, have tried to consciously see if they could avoid exclusionary behavior that would get the attention of antitrust authorities. They know that the litigation didn't do Microsoft any favors. It was expensive. It cost Microsoft, a lot of money in the end. Probably in the end, close to $8 billion. They would prefer not to be in that situation.
So let's talk about Uber and Lyft, because this is another interesting discussion around monopolies. The battle between Uber and Lyft has seen some really vicious practices, particularly on the part of Uber. Why hasn't there been significant legal scrutiny of Uber? Right.
So you probably have two. There are two things operating. In a way, you've referred to both of them in our discussion of Microsoft. So the first thing is if you're looking at single firm behavior, you have to find they have a monopoly position in some market. So where do they have that? I mean, they're taxi companies. If you define the market as taxi service or, I don't know, service on however you want to define taxis, they seem to be competing. So they are competing against Lyft, but they don't have a monopoly. Now, you could define the market, a little more narrowly, and maybe they do have a monopoly. But that's the first legal question. The second one is, I think, from the point of view of antitrust enforcement authorities, they've liked Uber. So they view Uber as the upstart, the disruptive technology that is disrupting the taxi monopoly, which has been legally protected in many municipalities around the country and really around the world. So, this was the public relations part you talked about from Microsoft. Uber has been seen to some extent as the pro-competitive force. Now, will that last forever? Nothing does. So, there may at some point emerge, a market definition that's, internet-based, calling of cars, and maybe some of their behavior will come into focus then. But until then, it's not.
So we touched on these other companies briefly, like the Amazon, Facebook. How can we develop some heuristics for classifying these highly differentiated internet businesses as monopoly or not?
Well, from a legal point of view, the first question is monopoly of what? Monopolizing what? And I think, the first thing is to figure out, what sort of products are they selling? Where do they seem to have dominance or a high share? That's sort of the first cut. I'm not sure of what, there are different people who look at this. If you're counseling one of these firms, it depends on sort of what their business model is and how aggressive they want to be, how close to the line or further from the line they would want to be, and understanding their business and that sort of thing. From a prosecutor's point of view, it's just what I said. It's looking to see what market you think they're dominating, and really trying to identify what the problems are. Are they being aggressive competitors that help customers, or are they being aggressive competitors that are trying to shut down their competition? And roughly speaking, that's the line you're trying to draw, and it's not always an easy one.
Right. Now, how does the EU, or maybe other, I think EU is the most salient nation to compare to the United States in terms of these technology debates, but how does the EU compare to how the United States looks at these types of issues? I mean, I know there's some stuff going on with Google in the EU right now. I think Microsoft had some conflicts with the EU as well. How does the EU position itself, and how is that different than the United States? Well,
there are a couple of differences. Most antitrust systems around the world are willing to intervene at a lower threshold of market power. So abuse of dominance, they're willing to be interventionist at a firm that's got a pretty large market share, but maybe not 80 or 90%. So they're willing, basically that turns out to be they're willing to intervene sooner, not let this come to the position where they're such a dominant firm that it gets harder and harder to deal with. Most enforcement agencies have a law that allow them to be more aggressive. Now, whether they will be or not may depend on a lot of things. So the Europeans, I think, are in some sense, more favorably disposed to state intervention, and thinking that through this intervention against dominant firms, they can make things better. They can stop these practices and increase competition. In the U.S., enforcers and the courts in particular have become more conservative about this and more hesitant to intervene, and maybe have more faith that markets will fix things before they can fix things. So, sort of generally, we have a little more thumb on the scale in favor of markets. Europeans may have a little more thumb on the scale in favor of government intervention and the government making things better. And that may be more true around the world, which is generally less impressed with the markets will always make things better, and just let it go and we'll be fine. The U.S. has been pretty high on that for a while, and other countries are less so.
Now, you wrote a textbook about Microsoft's legal proceedings. Give me a description for how you felt in the process of writing that book, and whether anything has changed in your attitudes or how you feel about the content that you wrote in that textbook since you wrote it.
Well, it was a great challenge. It took us a little while to write it. Probably longer than it should have. But what it allowed us to do, although we didn't realize we were going to be able to do this when we started out, was to write the story from beginning to end. So actually, it's about a 15-year story, in fact, and we were able to, really write it from start to finish. So in that sense, I feel really good about it, and it was challenging to get those events, all of those events, into a somewhat readable, somewhat not in a 1,000-page book. Hopefully useful. So now, what was the second part of your question?
Well, so has anything changed?
What's changed? Sorry, I apologize. I think in part, as I said earlier, I think I'm a little more positive about some of the good aspects of the remedy. I still think that we missed the boat overall in doing something about the monopoly in the operating system. So in that sense, I think my attitude on that changed. I think one of the things that did not change, sort of the benefit of the length of time, people in the technical world are, and this was true also of the lawyers, were really impressed by how fast things move. So the line was, the courts proceed on legal time and the technology proceeds on internet time. We'll never catch up. And I think as you look back on it, technology didn't move as fast in a real sense as we thought it was going to, and there was more time for the law to really affect the incentives of the parties and to really have things come out better. So if you think about, what is an important piece of software today, it turns out that browsers are still pretty important. So maybe that hasn't changed. Are operating systems important? Well, maybe the PC isn't as important, but it's still pretty important, certainly on the enterprise side. So I think there are certain things that the length of time of the book that it took us to write gave us some unanticipated benefits, and that may have been one of them.
All right, Harry. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. It's been a real treat talking to you, and a real diversion from the typical Software Engineering Daily format, and well, I'm grateful for that. So thanks for coming on the show.
It's my pleasure, Jeff. I'm glad you called. Thanks.
Thanks to Symfano for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symfano is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symfano.com/sedaily. That's SYMPHONO.com/SEdaily. Thanks again, Symfano.